In the middle of the 1700s, the American colonies were a spiritual powder keg. The Great Awakening was tearing through the landscape with emotional fire, while a dizzying array of competing sects, from mystical hermits to strict traditionalists, vied for the souls of the New World. Amidst this religious chaos, a single document emerged to prevent the Baptist movement from dissolving into 1,000 different pieces. It was more than a statement of faith. It was a theological constitution that bridged the gap between the ancient ruggedness of the Welsh mountains and the untamed American frontier. This is the story of the Philadelphia Confession of 1742, the standard of orthodoxy that didn't just define a denomination, but built the intellectual and organizational backbone of what would become the largest Protestant body in America. From the clandestine meetings of Welsh dissenters to the founding of Ivy League halls, today, we uncover how a few thousand words of pure Protestant heritage fixed the character of a nation's faith for centuries. The Philadelphia Confession of 1742 stands as the most influential document in the history of American Baptist life, serving as the theological anchor that stabilized a burgeoning movement within the religious pluralism of the Middle Colonies. More than a mere list of shared beliefs, it represented a strategic standard of orthodoxy, designed to unify a disparate collection of congregations under the banner of Reformed theology. While the Great Awakening began to stir the spiritual passions of the American colonies, the Philadelphia Association recognized that emotional fervor required a sturdy intellectual and doctrinal framework to prevent the fragmentation of the faith into various sectarian tangents. The significance of this document transcends its specific articles. It represents the formalization of a particular Baptist identity on American soil. By adopting a confession that was deeply rooted in the 1689 Second London Confession, the early American Baptists were not merely copying English precedents. Instead, they were making a profound statement of continuity, asserting that their movement was a legitimate, historical, and pure expression of the Protestant Reformation. This confession acted as a theological compass, guiding the denomination through the challenges of regional diversity and the eventual expansion into the Southern colonies, where it would fundamentally shape the character of the Southern Baptist Convention at its inception. In an era defined by the absence of state-established churches in the Middle Colonies, the Philadelphia Confession provided a voluntary yet rigorous mechanism for maintaining doctrinal purity and moral discipline. It bridged the gap between the radical individual freedom of the frontier and the structured ecclesiology of the Old World. Through its focus on the sovereignty of God, the authority of Scripture, and the necessity of a regenerate church membership, the 1742 Confession became the turning point that fixed the Calvinistic character of the denomination for over a century, providing the educational and organizational momentum that birthed institutions like Brown University. The genesis of the Philadelphia Confession is inextricably linked to the migration of Welsh Baptists, whose arrival in the late 17th and early 18th centuries infused the American movement with a robust, reformed spirit. These settlers did not arrive as theological blank slates. They brought with them a purer Protestant heritage forged in the fires of dissent within the United Kingdom. The Welsh influence was the primary catalyst in ensuring that the emerging American Baptist identity would be decidedly particular, or Calvinistic, rather than general or Arminian. At the heart of this foundational period was the tireless leadership of Abel Morgan. Morgan's role was not merely administrative. He functioned as a theological architect for the Middle Colonies. Upon assuming the pastorate at Pennepek, located in Lower Dublin, modern-day Philadelphia, the primary mother church that served as the organizational anchor for association, he began a systematic effort to organize works across Cape May, Hopewell, and Montgomery. His contribution was pivotal because he understood that for the Baptist movement to survive the pressures of a diverse colonial landscape, it required more than just shared enthusiasm. It needed a written, transmittable heritage. Morgan's methodology relied heavily on the principle of confessional continuity. He drew directly from the Welsh Ridwilliam Statement, which was itself an adaptation of the 1689 London Confession. By translating and promoting these documents, Morgan ensured that the specific doctrines of grace, election, effectual calling, and the final perseverance of the saints were woven into the very fabric of the new American churches. This Welsh legacy provided the spirit, doctrines, and worship patterns that eventually moved beyond Pennsylvania and New Jersey to shape the Baptist witness in the southern colonies. The mechanics of this influence resided in the Welsh commitment to a divinely ordered sequence of faith and practice. They viewed the confession not as a replacement for the Bible, but as a necessary summary of it that guarded against the doctrines of compromise. By establishing the 1689 London Confession as the basis for what would become the Philadelphia document, Morgan and his contemporaries effectively imported a mature theological system. This allowed the Philadelphia Association to emerge in 1707 not as a hesitant experiment, but as a confident bastion of Reformed theology with a clear mandate for doctrinal discipline and organizational unity. This transatlantic bridge ensured that the specific Welsh tract of Baptist life, emphasizing both the sovereignty of God and the necessity of a disciplined, covenanted community, would become the dominant DNA of the American Baptist tradition. The socio-religious landscape of the Middle Colonies provided a fertile, albeit chaotic soil that necessitated the structural rigidity of the Philadelphia Confession. Unlike the New England colonies, which were dominated by a Congregationalist establishment, or the Southern colonies where the Anglican Church enjoyed state-sanctioned authority, the Middle Colonies functioned as a laboratory of religious pluralism. In this environment, no single state church existed to enforce theological uniformity. While this vacuum allowed for unprecedented legal freedom, it also invited a bewildering array of competing sects and theological variations that threatened to dilute the Baptist witness. By the turn of the 18th century, Pennsylvania had become a mosaic of dissenting groups, including regular Baptists, Mennonites, Tunkers, and the Christian Quakers. The methodology of Baptist survival in this milieu was not found in isolation, but in the articulation of a clear, distinct identity that could withstand the gravitational pull of surrounding movements. For instance, the rise of the Ephrata sect in the 1730s, a group that fractured from the Tunkers under the charismatic leadership of Conrad Beissel, served as a stark reminder of how easily religious communities could drift into idiosyncratic mysticism without a shared standard of truth. The absence of a centralized government religious authority meant that the reason behind Baptist organizational development was rooted in self-preservation. To prevent their members from being absorbed into the diverse population of neighboring sects, Baptist leaders realized that a voluntary association required a rigorous, written framework. The Philadelphia Confession served this purpose by acting as a boundary marker. It established a sophisticated yet accessible set of parameters that defined what it meant to be a Baptist in a land where anyone could claim the title. By codifying their beliefs in a region defined by radical diversity, the Philadelphia Association transformed a collection of scattered congregations into a unified denominational body capable of sustained growth. The formalization of the Philadelphia Association in 1707 was the institutional manifestation of a theological unity that had been simmering for decades. This body, the First Baptist Association in America, emerged from a core group of 5 churches, Pennepek and the Welsh tract in Pennsylvania, along with Middletown, Piscataqua, and Cohansey in New Jersey. These founding members were already operating under the shadow of a shared confessional inheritance, specifically the 1689 Second London Confession. This inheritance provided a sense of transatlantic continuity, linking the fledgling American churches to the intellectual rigors of English particular Baptists. A central figure in this inheritance was the Keach family, whose influence bridged the gap between Old World scholarship and New World frontier ministry. The arrival of Elias Keach, son of the prominent London theologian Benjamin Keach, marked a pivotal moment in momentum of Baptist expansion. After his conversion and baptism by Thomas Dungan, the founder of Pennsylvania's First Baptist Congregation, Elias Keach took up a wide-ranging itinerant ministry through Philadelphia and New Jersey. His work as the pastor of Pennepek was instrumental in disseminating the Keachian version of the London Confession, which emphasized not just abstract theology, but the practical worship patterns of the church. By 1724, the association took the definitive step of officially owning a confession of faith. This was not a mere suggestion of belief, but the establishment of a standard of orthodoxy. The reason behind this move was twofold: to provide a mechanism for settling internal disputes and to present a unified front to the outside world. This confessional adoption meant that any church wishing to join the association had to align its pulse with the reformed heartbeat of the 1689 document. This confessional inheritance ensured that when the association eventually printed its own version in 1742, it was not embarking on a new path, but reinforcing a foundation that had been laid by the Keaches and the earliest pioneers of the faith. The mid-18th century brought a spiritual upheaval that tested the foundations of every colonial denomination. The Great Awakening, characterized by the itinerant preaching of figures like George Whitefield, introduced a surge of evangelical fervor that prioritized personal conversion and emotional experience. For the Philadelphia Association, this movement presented a dual challenge: how to embrace the genuine spiritual vitality of the revival, while ensuring it did not erode the doctrinal precision of their Reformed heritage. The 1742 formal adoption and printing of the Confession was the association's definitive answer to this tension. This was not a stagnant preservation of the past, but a dynamic application of truth to a new context. To address the specific needs of the American frontier and the nuances of the revival, the association added two crucial chapters that were absent from the 1689 London original: of singing of psalms and of laying on of hands. The reason behind the inclusion of congregational singing was rooted in the desire to unify the affections of the believer with the intellect of the doctrine. By formalizing music as an ordinance, they channeled the revival's energy into a structured corporate act. Similarly, the laying on of hands served as a visible confirmation of a believer's place within the covenant community. These additions demonstrated the ethos of confessional evolution, adapting the vessel without altering the theological water it contained. The document was no longer just a British import. It was a uniquely American instrument of ecclesiastical order that could navigate the high seas of the awakening without drifting into emotionalism. At the core of the Philadelphia Confession lies a profound commitment to the supremacy of the written word. The framers did not view the Confession as an authority over the Bible, but as a systematic reflection of it. In a colonial era, where new revelations and mystical impulses often competed for the believer's attention, the Confession's first chapter, of the Holy Scriptures, functioned as the final arbiter for all matters of faith and practice. The expression of this scriptural focus was manifested in the meticulous use of proof texts. Every theological claim within the document was tethered to specific biblical citations, ensuring that the source of truth remained external to human opinion. This approach empowered the laity and the clergy alike to test every sermon and every practice against a fixed standard. By asserting that the Scriptures are the only sufficient, certain, and infallible rule, the Confession provided a cognitive anchor in an age of shifting religious opinions. The reason behind this rigid adherence to sola scriptura was to safeguard the purity of the Church. For the Philadelphia Baptists, any doctrine not explicitly grounded in the Word was a potential inroad for error. This high view of Scripture ensured that the association's growth was not merely numerical, but theological. It established a culture where the Bible was not just a devotional book, but a legal charter for the Church's existence. This foundational principle ensured that even as the denomination expanded into diverse geographic and social strata, the centrality of the Word remained the common denominator that held the movement together. At the heart of the 1742 document lies a vigorous defense of the doctrines of grace, which serve as the intellectual engine of the entire confession. The framers operated from the conviction that the salvation of humanity is a work initiated, sustained, and perfected by God alone. This emphasis on divine sovereignty was not merely a philosophical preference, but a strategic bulwark against the encroaching tide of Arminianism, which suggested that human will played a decisive role in the redemptive process. The essence of this theological stance was articulated through the lens of unconditional election and effectual calling. The Confession posits that before the foundation of the world, God chose a specific people for his own glory. This was not a passive observation of future faith, but an active, sovereign decree. By grounding the believer's security in the unchangeable will of God, rather than the fluctuating emotions of the human heart, the Confession provided a sense of unshakable confidence to a people living in the uncertainty of the colonial frontier. The reason behind this rigid Calvinism was deeply practical. It fostered a spirit of profound humility and total dependence. If salvation was entirely a gift of grace, then no individual or denomination could claim spiritual superiority. Furthermore, this theology provided the fuel for evangelism. Contrary to the critique that sovereignty stifles mission, the Philadelphia Baptists believed that because God had decreed the end, salvation, he had also ordained the means, the preaching of the gospel. This conviction gave the association the boldness to plant churches in hostile environments, certain that God's purposes could not be thwarted by human opposition. Beyond the abstract heights of decree and election, the Philadelphia Confession provided a granular blueprint for community through its definition of the local church. Unlike the hierarchical structures of the Church of England or the state-integrated models of New England, the Baptists championed a regenerate church membership. This principle dictated that the visible church should consist only of those who had made a credible profession of faith and had been baptized by immersion. The instrument of maintaining this purity was found in the covenantal bond. Each congregation was viewed as an independent, self-governing body, united not by legal compulsion, but by a voluntary spiritual contract between the members and God. This ecclesiology turned the local church into a school of discipline, where members held one another accountable to the standards set forth in the confession. This internal regulation was the Baptist answer to the lack of state-enforced morality. They replaced the external sword of the magistrate with the internal discipline of the covenanted community. The reason behind this emphasis on order was the preservation of the temple of God. By strictly defining the qualifications for officers, pastors and deacons, and the administration of the ordinances, the confession ensured that the church remained a distinct counterculture. It provided the tools for governance that allowed these churches to remain stable, even when they lacked formal theological seminaries or professional hierarchies. This commitment to order transformed the Baptist movement from a collection of independent radicals into a disciplined army, capable of collective action and long-term institutional survival. The two distinct editions made in the 1742 revision, of singing of psalms and of laying on of hands, represented more than just procedural updates. They were the practical application of theology to the lived experience of the believer. While many contemporary religious groups viewed congregational singing with suspicion or restricted it to specific biblical texts, the Philadelphia Baptists argued for the vocal expression of praise as a moral duty. The essence of this practice involved a transition from silent meditation to corporate, audible worship. By formalizing this in Chapter 23, the association asserted that singing was an ordinance of Christ, designed to stir the soul and unify the congregation in a shared emotional and intellectual confession. This move successfully bridged the gap between the Reformed mind and the revivalist heart, allowing the theological truths of the confession to be memorized and internalized through melody. Similarly, the inclusion of the laying on of hands, Chapter 31, served as a symbolic initiation into the full privileges of church membership. This was not viewed as a source of extra-biblical revelation, but as a visible confirmation of the believer's baptism and their reception into the body. By insisting on this rite, the association ensured a clear demarcation between the world and the church. It provided a tangible moment of ecclesiastical blessing that reinforced the solemnity of the covenant. These unique American additions allowed the confession to function not just as a textbook of doctrine, but as a manual for liturgy that shaped the very atmosphere of Baptist gatherings. The intellectual rigor of the Philadelphia Confession naturally birthed a culture of scholarship that sought to elevate the educational standards of the Baptist ministry. The association operated on the conviction that a learned clergy was the best defense against the theological drift and emotional excesses of the era. This led directly to the 1764 sponsorship of the first Baptist college in America, originally known as Rhode Island College and later as Brown University. The basis of this educational expansion was rooted in the association's commitment to literary and theological excellence. They did not view faith and reason as antagonists, but as complementary tools for understanding the Creator. By establishing a center for higher learning, the Philadelphia Baptists sought to provide their leaders with the linguistic and historical skills necessary to defend the confession against increasingly sophisticated intellectual challenges. The reason behind this institutional investment was to ensure the longevity of the Baptist witness. The association recognized that without a mechanism for training the next generation, their standard of orthodoxy would eventually fade. Brown University became the intellectual lighthouse that radiated the values of the Philadelphia Confession throughout the colonies. It transformed the denomination from a marginal sect into a cultural force, proving that the high Calvinism of the 1742 document was compatible with the highest levels of academic inquiry and civic contribution. The formalization of the Philadelphia Confession marked the definitive turning point in the trajectory of American Baptist life, effectively securing the reformed character of the denomination against competing theological systems. While early Baptist efforts in New England often grappled with strong Arminian leanings, the basis for the Philadelphia Association's success lay in its aggressive yet orderly expansion. By providing a clear written standard of orthodoxy, the association offered a stable alternative to the theological fluidity of the frontier, eventually overcoming the Arminian influence that had initially dominated the northern colonies. This influence radiated southward with remarkable velocity. In 1767, the Charleston Association in South Carolina, the first Baptist association in the South, officially adopted the Philadelphia document, frequently referred to as the Charleston Confession in that region. The reason behind this adoption was the need for a unified voice among coastal churches to resist Anglican pressure and to establish a pure Protestant witness. This migration of doctrine ensured that when the Southern Baptist Convention was organized in 1845, every single delegate belonged to a congregation that traced its theological lineage back to the 1742 document. The confession served as the unifying DNA that allowed a geographically dispersed movement to maintain a singular identity. Despite its long period of dominance, the 19th century introduced new social and theological pressures that began to erode the Calvinistic hegemony of the Philadelphia Confession. The American frontier, characterized by a spirit of radical individualism and democratic populism, often found the high Calvinism of the 1742 document, with its emphasis on sovereign election and limited human ability, to be culturally strident and difficult to communicate to the unchurched masses. The manifestation of this transition was evidenced by the rise of more moderate statements of faith, most notably the New Hampshire Confession of 1833. This newer document sought to soften the edges of traditional Reformed theology, offering a less rigorous presentation of the doctrines of grace that appealed to a broader audience. As the denomination grew more diverse and the frontier spirit took hold, the Philadelphia Confession gradually moved from being the primary active charter of the churches to becoming a venerated relic of their historical foundation. However, the reason of the Confession's enduring legacy is found in its lasting remnants. Even as the formal document saw a decline in use, its core theological convictions remained embedded in the local church covenants across the South and the Middle colonies. The document's commitment to scriptural authority and orderly church life continued to summarize the Baptist outlook long after the specific articles were no longer read from the pulpit. The Philadelphia Confession did not so much disappear as it infused the very marrow of American Baptist identity, leaving behind a permanent watermark of Reformed orthodoxy that continues to influence the denomination's understanding of God, the church, and the world. To conclude this exploration of a foundational pillar of American faith, consider the following invitations to deepen your engagement with this history. Take a moment to consider the theological anchors in your own life or community. The framers of the Philadelphia Confession believed that without a clear written standard, a movement would eventually drift into the currents of cultural whim. In an age of rapid change and digital noise, what are the non-negotiable truths that provide your standard of orthodoxy? How does the transatlantic continuity of your own heritage, the stories and beliefs passed down through generations, shape the way you navigate the complexities of the modern world? The Philadelphia Baptists didn't just inherit a faith, they actively owned it, refined it, and built institutions to protect it. Reflection is the first step toward that same kind of intentionality. If you found value in this deep dive into the why and how behind the religious history of America, don't let the journey end here. Subscribe to Theology today as we dive into the past and see our rich faith history to propel us to faithfulness today.